Olá, bom dia.
Hello, good morning. My name is João De Biase. I'm responsible for the corporate banking area at Santander Bank Brazil. I would like to thank the presence of our invitees, Paula Vescovi, our head economist, former Treasury Secretary, and Appy, Bernard Appy, so that we can talk about tax reform and the forecasts regarding that topic in Brazil. It's always good to remember that I also would like to thank you for being here on this online edition and our fourth meeting with multinational clients. I'd like to start by giving Ana the floor. Good morning, João. I would also like to thank everyone for being here, all who are following us in this fourth meeting with multinational clients. I would like to particularly thank Bernard Appy for his participation. I'm going to quickly introduce him, and I'd like to say that all who'd like to participate on this live can send us messages on WhatsApp. I can see that on the screen, and I can interact with you through that. Bernard is founder and director of CCEF and one of the major players on the debate of tax reform in Brazil. He has been studying tax reform for a long time. It started with his working in the federal government in the Treasury Department. He was executive secretary and secretary for tax reform. He had many executive experiences. He was president of the board of Banco do Brasil. And so it is with great pleasure that we welcome Bernardo Appy to talk to us about tax reform. And I'd like to start with a brief provocation. We are once again discussing that topic at the Chamber of Deputies. Some proposals have been rejected by the government, other by representatives, and I wanted to hear from Bernard what is his understanding ever since the Federal Constitution of 1988. This tax reform is trying to be passed, so it's one of the most complex businesses in the world. So Bernard, welcome to our live, and you have the floor. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Santander for the invitation to participate on this debate. I'd like to greet João and Natalia particularly because when she was working for the state and federal government, she provided major contributions for Brazil as a country. In Brazil, we have been discussing tax reform. And when we talk about tax reform, we're talking about tax on consumption reform and also income tax reform. I'm going to talk first about the tax on consumption reform and then the income tax reform. Brazil probably has the worst taxing system for goods and services in the world. We have 5 general taxes that are applied to goods and services, 3 federal, PIS and COFINS, and the industrialized products tax, ICMS, which is the circulation tax, and a municipal tax on services as well. So not only we have a huge number of taxes, there is a fragmented basis. So we have goods with ICMS and services with ISS, and it's all very complex system full of exceptions, a huge number of tax benefits and special regimens that are different ways of charging or withholding that tax. So this is a major loss in terms of productivity and in terms of growth potential for the country, and that results from many factors, particularly the complexity of the system, which makes the compliance cost and the bureaucracy cost in Brazil to be, if not the highest, one of the highest in the world. We have a huge level of tax litigation here in Brazil. One of the main reasons is the complexity of the tax system. There is a study from INSPER that says that the inventory of tax litigation is a huge amount of the GDP, and the litigation could be up to 40 or 50% of the Brazilian GDP. So due to failures in the system of taxing for goods and services, there is an increase, a relevant increase in the cost of exports and imports. There is a loss of competitiveness by the country and huge allocation issues. So the structure in Brazil is set up very inefficiently due to these situations in the tax system. The correction of these distortions, and when I talk about correcting it for goods or services, we should adopt an added value tax, a good added value tax. The correction of these distortions would have a major impact on the growth of the country. There are many studies done on that subject, many relevant impacts. One that was funded by my institution, showing what would be the effects on the GDP if those corrections were to be made. So distortions of the tax system that hinder Brazil growth, these distortions in the taxing of goods and services are probably the most relevant. Brazil has been discussing changes on tax on consumption ever since our 1988 constitution. We missed an opportunity of doing tax reform right then and there when the constitution was promulgated. Then we had almost a moment of reform in the Fernando Henrique administration, in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration, then 2 attempts in the Lula administration, which I followed because then I was serving at the federal branch. And recently it came back to the table, this discussion, due to the maturing of this debate in Brazil. And now in 2019, due to this maturing of the level of discussion, 2 proposals for bills of law were introduced to try to improve the Brazilian models for tax on goods and services. One was a proposal that proposed to replace all of these 5 taxes by one goods and service tax, an added value tax. It would be one single tax for the taxpayer that would be managed by the federal government, state government, and municipal government. Its revenues would be distributed and would have a good characteristics, a wide base of goods and services reaching every activity, full credit, everything that is tied to production activity, and there would be very homogeneous rules. PEC 45, this bill, provided the tax for all services. Another proposal, another bill of law was proposed by the Senate that has been discussed as of recent, but the problem is that these two projects presented in 2019 were never backed by the government, never backed by the federal administration. They were just being discussed by the legislative. So there was a mixed commission of Chamber of Deputies and senators representatives. They started working in 2020. Then with the pandemic, works were interrupted. Now they are resumed. But with the change in the presidency of the Chamber of Deputies, the new Hammer signaled that he was not interested in advancing with Bill of Law PEC 45, which was supported by the former Hammer, Rodrigo Maia. So we now have PEC 110 at the Federal Senate on October 5th. Roberto Rocha, the rapporteur, presented a report. It has many similar characteristics to PEC 45. It's a good project that would greatly improve the Brazilian tax system, but it is different in one point. Rather than having one single tax, federal, state, and municipal, we would have an added value tax at the federal level, a contribution on goods and services, and a subnational one, which would be a tax on goods and services at the state and city level. And it would replace the IPI for an excise tax that would apply only to goods and services that are detrimental to the environment and health. This is now being discussed in the Brazilian Senate, but there hasn't been any sessions of the Senate, and so these discussions are at a halt. It has an advantage of being an important political construct where we were able to get the clear support of all Brazilian states, the backing of all Brazilian states. That had never happened before. 27 states supporting the tax reform. The small and medium-sized municipalities also are behind that bill of law, but there is a resistance of major cities that want to keep their tax on goods and services because from a federative standpoint, that would be the main issue to be resolved in terms of tax reform discussion. And this reform is also greatly supported by the Brazilian industry, but there are some restrictions on the services and agribusiness segments. But Roberto Rocha's, the senator's report allowed the possibility of some differentiated regimens, but that would be defined by complementary law that would talk about this tax reform rather than the constitutional reform. So in the discussion of this constitutional amendment, we could talk about these other elements of tax reform. In 2020, the federal government sent to the Brazilian Congress a bill of law that proposed similar reform elements, is PL 3887, but ever since July, no changes in the approval or discussion of this project have been heard of. It would be replacing PIS and COFINS tax for one single tax. In terms of cost benefit, it would be much better to work in a wider tax reform such as PEC 110 or PEC 45 that creates different ways out. This tax, this value-added tax for goods and services. So the resistance of the segments would be the same, but the benefit would be much wider reaching than just a reform on PIS and COFINS, and would benefit the growth of the country. This is the scenario. It's hard to predict what's going to happen. Within the Federal Senate, I would say that there is a positive feeling in terms of approving this proposal. But because this is a very complex topic that faces some resistance, we're still not quite clear as to what is going to happen. What we know is that if the tax reform is not going to advance this year, next year is going to be virtually impossible due to the elections. The second proposed tax reform is income tax reform. In Brazil, the questions regarding income tax reform, the issues are in terms of distribution. There is a perception, somewhat correct, but somewhat erroneous, that high income people don't pay a lot of tax because the income tax incides only on company profit distributions and not on the individual. Well, when you look at individuals, this taxing of profits doesn't show, but that's not necessarily correct. What is relevant when you consider the taxing of a shareholder, you have to consider what's the company's tax and what's the individual's tax. A lot of companies only withhold tax at the distribution at the company level, and some both at the company level, at the distribution, and the individual level. The rate for companies in Brazil is of 34%, 25% for individuals, and a social contribution on profits. And for financial institutions, this rate is higher. If you charge 34% and the rate in Brazil is 17.5%, the highest one for individual income tax, you wouldn't have a distribution problem. But in some cases, there is an issue when the taxing in the company is not, the profit that is taxable, when you compare, the profit, it's less than 34% rate. And so in the end, the stockholder is not taxed enough. And that happens in simplified tax regimes such as lucro presumido regimen, which is assumptive profit, where you have, for example, a service provider who gets paid through a company, and it's arbitrated that his profit would be 32% of his earnings, but it could be as high as 84%. So then you charge less than half of the rate of tax for the company. So there are distortions. There is also some questions about interest on owner's capital. A part of the profit of companies, the tax on profits, you could be distributed by deducting it from the calculation basis of the taxes for the company and taxing 15% at the distribution. So this profit would only be paying 15% rate in terms of tax rather than 34%. This is all part of the debate about the taxing of profits in Brazil. In this debate, the federal government proposed changes in the income tax. There would be a correction of the table for calculations for individuals. It would be necessary because, that hasn't been adjusted ever since 2015, and there is inflation. There would be a change in adjustment in tax over financial investments, and that's going in the right direction, and proposes a difference in the taxing of profits. And the government's proposal would be to end this regimen of interest on capital. And there were many different measures to avoid tax avoidance or tax evasion. These measures needed to be better discussed, but the Chamber of Deputies analyzed this project and is now in the Federal Senate being discussed there. It maintains the changes in tax for financial applications, the taxes on company profits, the changes in individual income tax, and there would be a drop from 34% to 15% tax on profits, and there are some exemptions. For example, if you are distributing to a holding or distributing to companies that make up to 4,400,000 a year. So this faced a negative response of the economic agencies and representatives from the economic segments. It would increase the tax issues with service providers. There is a major issue in terms of legal security, because that would incide over all profits up to 2021, and that certainly will be giving room for legal claim. There is a lot of resistance from the private sector, and it has been approved without any kind of discussion on alternative ways of taxing profit in Brazil and how to correct the distortions that exist now. I believe that this project is a bad one because of this exemption of up to 4 million reais a year. People with high income that don't pay a lot of taxes in Brazil would pay even less. I think it's bad in terms of economic efficiency because it makes the system more complex. And this equity and third-party capital, which is debt, is going to be worsened by this change that's being proposed. And what is happening at the Federal Senate is that Rapporteur Ângelo Coronel, a senator, he has been giving signals that he just wants to approve a change in the individual income tax table and leave the rest for the next administration. What is going to happen? We don't know what's going to happen. Here in Brazil, they say that politics is like a cloud. You look at it, and 10 minutes later, the shape has changed. So today, probably this major change in the model of taxing profits in Brazil is probably not going to be changed, but you can't be sure about that. And this insecurity is creating an issue in Brazil. companies, because they are afraid of taxing on profit, all Brazilian companies are prepared to do major profit sharing this year, something that wouldn't happen if there wasn't for this issue. Some companies are acquiring debt not to be harmed by any changes in the income tax. And fact is that probably the change won't come, but the risk of that happening has been leading companies to prepare for this situation. And if the idea is not to go forward with that, the government should signal that they are not interested in that anymore, avoiding this major insecurity or unsafety feeling that could decapitalize companies if this extraordinary profit distribution is carried out due to exclusively tax issues. I'm sorry if I talked too much or if I went over the allotted time, but it was important to clarify what's happening in Brazil, and it's going to help our discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Bernard. I think your explanation was very positive and clear. The first question that we have here from the participants, you've already mentioned, is the feasibility of this reform or the reforms, because you have many different bills of law being discussed. But I wanted to talk about the feasibility of approval. I think that could be even something done in the short term, and there is the issue of strategy. So we have many topics on Brazilian tax that need to be looked at. It's very complex tax environment, and what we can say is that we heavily tax goods and services, not so much income, and obviously there are some distribution challenges. Also, we have a high level of subsidies, tax expenditures that are more than 4% of the GDP, that are not monies earned by the government because they are waiving the right to it through the subsidies. So should we start discussing goods and services? Should we start talking about a reduction of the subsidies? Should we also talk about individual tax income and corporate tax income? What would be your strategy for approaching this tax reform? What's your understanding in terms of the optimal way of doing that? As a former federal government executive, I think a change in the taxing of goods and services is essential for Brazil to grow more. And I believe that Brazil should change their income tax because there are some distortions that are unjustifiable. I don't know any other country in the world that has the distortions in terms of labor that we have, as we have here in Brazil, particularly because of autonomous workers. The debate that's more mature, though, is the debate on the taxing of goods and services. Currently, we are very clear about what needs to be done. Of course, we have some resistances that need to be broken, but I believe that the debate is a lot more mature, and therefore, this change in the taxing of goods and services involving all taxes is more mature and more prone to be, changed by the government. Up until recent, the current administration positioned itself against the tax reform. Then when we started promoting PEC 110, Roberto Rocha fulfilled all the requests of the federal government in terms of resources and in terms of what would be done. All the requests had been fulfilled, so now the administration is not against it, but is also not supported. So I believe it's very hard for a bill of law like that to be passed without the backing of the current administration. And I think it's going to be a debate for the next administration. Perhaps it will make advancements in the federal government level. In the Chamber of Deputies, I don't believe it's going to advance much. So I believe it's going to be something dealt with the following administration. The good thing is that the next administration is going to know exactly what are the alternatives in terms of breaking down political resistances, and in 2023 perhaps they can advance and approve that reform. In terms of income tax, there is a point, an important point. You talked about tax benefits for tax expenditures. Well, the way that we tax goods and services and the way that it's supposed to be in PAC 45 or PAC 110, it would end all of these tax benefits, something that could be alike or akin to 2 to 3% of the GDP in terms of state and municipal tax that would be eliminated by this reform without increasing the tax load. So when you take down the benefits, generally you increase the tax burden, but the bringing down of tax benefits is now going to be incorporated into a smaller rate for the new taxes without increasing the tax burden. So therefore, in terms of goods and services, we are eliminating everything. What you'd have would be a tax benefit for the Manaus free commercial zone, and also small and very small companies benefit that would be maintained. Saying that we would bring down tax costs. Well, recently in Brazil, early this year, we approved the constitutional amendment, a tax constitutional amendment that established that there would be a limitation of 2% of the GDP. Of course, the drafting of that was kind of confusing. People believe that the government would reduce their tax benefits by 2% of the GDP, but the tax benefits are nearly or virtually not reduced because there are exceptions that correspond exactly to the 2% of the GDP. So the government had a project for the elimination of tax benefits that was very modest, that hasn't made much advancements in terms of effectively reducing tax costs here in Brazil, or tax expenditures here in Brazil. So the way to do that is how you propose it on Bill of Law, PAC 45 and 110, discussing it more generally rather than individually, so not to create more resistance. Regarding income tax reform, I believe that we need to mature this idea a little bit more. This was a topic that wasn't discussed up until 2 or 3 years ago. We haven't come to a level of maturity, though, on what is the best model to be adopted. I believe it's quite probable that we'll come to the end of 2022 with a good level of maturity on the topic, which would also allow the next administration to propose a tax reform on income tax. And if there is a good design, I don't see any issue of having a tax reform for goods and services that would require a tax amendment, and the income tax, which would be ordinary law and easier to advance. So, and from a political standpoint, they are complementary. If you're talking about making changes that are important for growth, you're also correcting distribution distortions, and that would help in the political debate regarding tax reform. The issue is that now Brazil doesn't have enough maturity to have a good reform project for income tax. The debate is not mature enough, is not ripe in terms of, the different alternatives that are being proposed and what's being discussed in the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. Well, it's very common for you to find a trade-off between equity, progressiveness, and economic efficiency. In the tax reform for consumption, that doesn't happen, but in regards to income tax, that is a fact, even though the degree of distortion in Brazil is so huge that I believe that we could make changes that improve in terms of progress without having deleterious effects in terms of economic efficiency. But in order to do that, you need to do that very well. And I believe that we are still not ready to do that. More specifically about one topic, there is the matter of how you comprise the tax in Brazil. You generally tax the consumption base and payroll. Social contributions on payroll are extremely high in Brazil. The level of informal workers is very high, but in terms of the rate that is taxed for payroll is higher here in Brazil than any other country in the OECD. So we are exploiting income and also wealth. So I see a space for correcting distortions, particularly income tax distortions, individual income tax distortions. But at first, I would probably try to reduce the taxes on payroll, not linearly, but more intelligently. The most important change should be having the first minimum salary that would make a change in terms of the formalization of low-income workers. So this is a discussion that must be entertained. That's one of the changes in the project that was approved because it decreases the tax on income and increases the tax on consumption. So it's exactly the opposite of what needs to be done to improve the Brazilian taxing environment. So I think this is important, and particularly I understand that a good labor tax reform is important. Taxes that incide on salaries is a tax on formal work. And that needs to be discussed together with the changes of income tax and how it works here in Brazil. I hope that I have answered your question. Yes, it was a brilliant explanation that allows us to understand the neutrality of a tax reform. That's something that's very present in the discussion. And there's a reason for that. We have a high income tax burden and tax burden considering we are a developing country and if we compare it with our peers. So there is an expectation from some players that a tax reform might reduce the tax burden. On the other hand, Brazil has an imbalance and so there are other players that would like to see a quick macroeconomic stability in Brazil, and they believe that this tax reform could help balance out these accounts. There is a debate that's open, and there is the fear of everything that was done in the past, regarding tax reforms that were done to increase the tax burden. So people are afraid, people are weary, but it makes it creates an additional complexity in terms of the strategy for tax reform. So Bernard, I would like you to comment about this tax neutrality, because I believe you talked very well about the different spaces that we have to increase the tax burden for some segments that are undertaxed in comparison to other countries, so that we can fund the tax adjustment in other segments. And with that, how could we anchor this debate? Sometimes is very open and biased due to differences in ideology. How could we anchor that? For example, when asking for becoming a member of the OECD and, foreign trade, and how would that impact? So I believe these are two questions. The issue if the tax reform should increase or decrease the tax burden. Well, Brazil doesn't have any space for a decreasing of tax burden. I believe that if you do a good tax reform, particularly regarding consumption tax, you would improve the tax through a growth in the economy. If you reform and you increase the potential for growth and you keep control on the expenditures, it means that even if you have the same tax burden in face of the GDP, you would have greater tax collection, improving the fiscal standing of the country. So my idea is that we should be neutral in terms of tax reform face of GDP. We wouldn't increase the tax burden, but with more growth, it would give you the conditions for you to do fiscal consolidation or tax consolidation in the future, as long as it comes with good measures for holding off expenditures. There have been changes in the flexibilization of the expenditures threshold. The pact that was approved yesterday by the Chamber of Deputies increases the space for expenditures in more than 1% of the GDP, breaking with this cap that we had for expenditures, and that is very bad from the tax standpoint in Brazil. So in terms of tax burden, my suggestion would be to maintain the tax burden. Regarding the OECD issue, particularly if we reform goods and services tax, that would allow us to have something more positive and in harmony with what happened internationally and with what happened at the OECD. And also there is some tax income issues. There are some rules for transfer prices. Well, Brazil has a transfer price model that's quite different from the ones that are used by OECD countries. It's very strange that income tax reform that is not dealt with. We are using the Brazilian model, which is a very particular model for transfer prices. There are some advantages and disadvantages to that model. There's one advantage that is less subjective than the OECD model. The OECD model has some subjective criteria where you consider the transfer price based on a transaction that you do with a non-related party, but Brazilian rules are more objective, more to the point. But I believe that if we want to go into the OECD, we need to bring the Brazilian rules in terms of transfer prices to the ones adopted by the other countries of the OECD. But that is a topic that's not been very discussed in Brazil. the income tax reform talked a lot about many subjects, but didn't talk about that subject in particular. Okay, so as you mentioned, the huge amount of litigation, you said that over 70% of the GDP, so it's huge. It's not even comparable to any other country. If we look at other countries, inclusively countries in Latin America, we're talking about 2 or 3% of the GDP, and we have over 70% of GDP. So I have some curiosity as to how I would go after a topic that I would call governance of risks, this relationship between the risk and taxpayer, the different legal instances. This is a very particular case to Brazil, and of course it's based on this excessive complexity in terms of taxes, a lack of definition. The discussion on what is an input or not on PIS/COFINS tells a lot about the history of this litigation, but our litigation environment is very open and includes many topics. So I would like to hear your point of view in terms of the relationship between the judiciary and the risks that it could pose to taxpayers. Okay, this litigation includes the municipal, state, and federal litigations. Generally, in Brazil, you have an administrative court, you have the municipal, state, and federal courts, and then if you can't resolve at that level, then it would be sent to the judiciary. Well, at the high level of litigation in Brazil, has many causes. One of the causes is the complexity of the tax system. A good reform in the taxing of goods and services, such as the one proposed by PEC 45 or PEC 110, the different bills of law, would apply one homogeneous rule for all taxpayers. There would be less of a possibility of having a difference between the taxpayers and the tax revenue service. So the second cause of litigation in Brazil is an excessive constitutionalization of tax concepts. These excessive tax concepts cause changes in ordinary law that verse on taxes, and oftentimes they're understood as unconstitutional. There are some cases here that are clearly problematic, but there are some cases where there have been too much interpretation of what the Constitution said, and there is an industry of litigation here in Brazil. The responsibility belongs to the private sector. Companies in Brazil like to litigate, particularly to tax litigate. I would just like to give you an example. The taxpayers, companies don't like what I say, but if you have to include ICMS tax or not, it doesn't make sense reviewing that kind of thing because the tax has already been in place. But this kind of questioning happens in Brazil. This type of litigation happens in Brazil. And I believe that Brazil has a major challenge of being at the center of a major administrative reform. We have to optimize the Constitution in Brazil to avoid so many possibilities of interpretations and constructions where, tax measures are considered unconstitutional. That never happens in other countries. Part of this litigation is about this excessive number of tax concepts in the Constitution. In other countries, the law defines that, and nobody's going to claim that is unconstitutional, as it happens in Brazil. And there is a third reason that I also believe it's very important in litigation, is that we have a very poor preliminary litigation resolution, and we need to have a good investment in a system that could resolve things before they go to litigation. There is a difference in interpretation between the revenue services and taxpayers that should be solved as quickly as possible. But here, the tax authorities are very bad at presenting their own interpretation, and that leaves room for litigation. So that's an important point. In most other countries, it's very rare for the tax authority opinion to be ruled unconstitutional or to be taken down by the judiciary. But here in Brazil, that's quite common. And that leads to litigation that sometimes take 20 years to be settled to the fullest. So I think it's an important work. So we need to simplify the legislation, deconstitutionalize the tax issues, particularly tax concepts, and having a more efficient litigation or interpretation differences, having a system that does that better. Well, the tax authorities sometimes change their opinions, and they apply that retroactively. So that's not rare here in Brazil. Well, I'm going to start closing because we have only 7 minutes left. I want to ask 2 more to the point questions. The first thing is about this new taxing on MICTAX that has been recently approved by trying to, have 15% tax applied to these major global operations that can arbitrate the tax process, and the taxing on fuel. We have a heated discussion about that in Brazil due to many issues, obviously, but we are discussing a fund to stabilize the price of fuel. But here in Brazil, we already have a contribution and intervention of economic domain. We should be using this mechanism. So these are 2 topics that are more specific that I'd like you to comment on. The thing about the big tax or major corporations, and well, regarding the big tax, is not only big tax, is major multinational corporations, and the discussion that's advancing in terms of the G20 meeting as 2 pillars, one of which is the introduction of minimum tax ratio of 15% for all countries, and the second pillar is the adoption of criteria for profit distribution of these companies, considering the country where this good or asset has been generated, the country of origin where the head offices of that multinational corporation are located, and the country where the different branches or subsidiaries are located at, which are low taxing countries. I think it's a good measure, at least is a reversal on a trend that we saw since the early 80s worldwide, which is a trend towards race to the bottom. The tax war between countries trying to get lower and lower rates in corporate tax to attract investments. This recent change, even though I believe that the implementation is going to be more complicated than people believe it's going to be, because it depends on you incorporating those changes into the national laws of each country, which is not a given. You need to, internalize that country by country, the formula. for profit distribution, for example, of these major multinational corporations in all the three locations. That's going to be a heated discussion and debate because there are many ways of doing that. So I believe it is a positive change because it signals a reversal of a trend, which was a bad trend, which was a trend to tax the income of major corporations lower and lower. Many of those companies can do tax administration and forecast, but I believe that there's still going to be a lot of discussion, but I believe that's still insufficient. I think the tax wars internationally are going to continue existing. This is an issue that's going to be mitigated by those changes, but it's not going to end. And as a matter of fact, in terms of income tax, coordination internationally is essential, and that's important even for leveling the playing field, causing all companies that are competing in the market to be competing equally. Tax planning is one of the determining factors for the competitiveness of companies worldwide, and it shouldn't be. And to resolve that, you need a level of international coordination that we are just starting to see now, but that still needs to make major strides. Regarding the taxing of fuels, well, just to explain, in Brazil, we have taxes such as PIS and COFINS, which are fixed and apply per liter. State-wise, it's a complicated system. Each different state calculates or researches the average price of sale to the end consumer and then defines their own rate, tax rate, and charges the refinery or importation, and you would be applying that per liter. Let's say that it would be going to a different state, it would be sold to the consumer for that price. Because the fuel prices are coming up in Brazil and worldwide, the oil prices are coming up and the real is devaluing, so the impact is even greater. That has created a major reaction, inclusively in politicians, and we started thinking of different ways by which the states calculate their ICMS tax on fuel. Many ideas came about, adopting price per liter immediately or an average of the past 24 months, but bottom line, the final effect would be reducing the revenues for the states. It would only reduce the price of fuel if you reduce the revenues for states. And there is a difference between states in Brazil, a huge difference, and it's hard to harmonize that in any possible way. And so we thought about a fund to stabilize prices. Brazil has an instrument to do that, which is called contribution of intervention on economic domain. The problem is that seed fuels, which would have this role of stabilizing prices, you would need to increase the value of seed. Seed is a minor tax because the government brought it down. So we don't have that instrument. Once the fuel prices go up, we don't have the tool that we need to make this price adjustment in the long term. First of all, does it make sense for the government to bring down the prices of fuel? No, it doesn't make any sense. We can't be discussing the tax on carbon. You can't stabilize price fluctuations. That could be done, but that would need to be done by the federal government, And the tool that we have to do that would be the SID fuels, but we would need to increase taxation when prices are low. From the standpoint of state taxes, the trend in terms of tax reform, and that's very clear on the report of the Commission. The idea is to create one single tax throughout Brazil for all single state per liter. Why should we wait for the tax reform to do that or not? Well, in the tax reform, there would be a transition of 20 years between the current taxation and the next form of taxation. And that would have less of an impact on the finances of the states. If you adopt it right away, you would have a major impact that would be hard to absorb in some states in Brazil. Taxing of fuel is over 70% of the total ICMS tax, so there is no way of doing that without affecting the states. So again, the long-term solution to rationalize all of that is tax reform, adopting a model that's more consistent. Structurally, it doesn't make any sense to fund fossil fuels. The rest of the world is discussing the stop using fossil fuels. And third, in regards to the price, the government needs to use the tools it has and that it hasn't been knowing how to use. So we are coming to the end of our live broadcast. I believe that we were able to cover the main topics. Thank you so much, Bernardo, for your comments on the main issues that show the challenges that we face in reforming the Brazilian tax environment. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. I'd like to thank Bernard for his availability. And Bernard, if you'd like to make any closing comments, we have 1 or 2 minutes left. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you again for the invitation to be part of this debate, and I'm going to emphasize what I have said already. Brazilian tax issues are very important for growth and distribution. I believe that we are maturing these discussions. I believe that we probably have the conditions to do a good tax reform in terms of goods and consumption. It hasn't been done because the administrations didn't want to do. Of course, with some concessions to make it feasible politically, but there was a possibility of doing that. But I hope that it becomes a priority for the next administration. Many candidates or future candidates already said that they would deal with that. And in terms of income tax, I believe that we are maturing our discussion level, and we'll come to the next administration with every condition to present a proposal that would be positive in terms of Brazilian economic growth. So I believe that's it. It is a very arid topic, very complicated, something that shouldn't be discussed hurriedly as it was with the income tax and the Chamber of Deputies. It's a very complex topic, but I am an optimist that we are going to have a more efficient and more fair country when we are able to carry out the reforms that are unavoidable. They are complex, but Brazil has shown with the Social Security reform that when something has matured, they are able to implement the necessary changes. Thank you so much, Bernard. And now I'm going to call Ricardo to close our meeting. Thank you, Ana. Thank you, Bernard Appy. Congratulations on the lecture. And I am Ricardo Santaella, responsible for multis on what we consider commercial banking. It was very gratifying to be part of this event with such great level of content. I would like to thank Esther, João, Mário, Sandro, and many others, the organization team, and all who followed us. You are the main reason why we are doing this live broadcast. I see that we had over 1,000 views on the lives yesterday. The content today is also going to be available in Portuguese and English so that those who didn't have the opportunity of doing so can access it later. We talked about many topics in the past 2 days. Our relationship managers, specialists, and economists are at your disposal, myself, Esther, and everyone, to discuss everything that was covered in this past 2 days and any other questions that you may have. In addition to the bilateral conversations between your team and ours, we are going to have new rounds, and it's going to be a pleasure to see you again. Count on us for the building and expansion of your business in Brazil and other countries where we are at. I wish you all a good afternoon. And for those who are ahead in terms of time, have a good evening. Thank you.